We had an interesting debate and interesting vote today regarding the Paris climate change agreement that it is a treaty. Hadn't been properly treated like a treaty, just like the Iran treaty was a treaty, and no matter whether the House or the Senate agreed to violate the Constitution and treat the Iran treaty in exactly the opposite format as required by the Constitution. Doesn't matter. It was a treaty. It was never properly ratified. Doesn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democrat that came up with the bill. It was a Republican. A senator or a House member cannot come up with a bill that changes the Constitution and said, you know what, we're going to take this treaty and act like you have to have 2/3 vote it down instead of 2/3 to ratify it. But that's what they did. So the president did exactly the right thing. It was time to stop giving billions of dollars in both direct money aid to the largest sponsor of terrorism, Iran, and it was also time to reimpose the sanctions that had basically brought Iran to its knees, begging for help. Well, the Obama administration helped them in two ways. Number one, allowing them to pursue nuclear capabilities, just doing it privately. I'm one of three people that met with the two main inspectors from the IAEA over in Europe, and regarding the question of, and they would issue the statement each time that they had seen no evidence that Iran was developing nukes, but in response to the question, did you see the military facilities that they keep so hidden and secret and where their nuclear development would be occurring? And they said no. They gave us a video that they said came from there, but we've never been allowed to examine the facilities. So the IAEA was not allowed to examine the facilities where the nuclear development, nuclear weapons would have been developed, probably were being developed. And from Iran's standpoint, based on how ridiculous the agreement was, they certainly, and knowing their mentality of cheating, certainly they would have been pursuing nuclear weapons. Whether or not they would wait for 10 years before actually going public with actually having nuclear weapons. But I even asked, okay, the Obama administration sent them $150 billion in cash. Let's say hypothetically, Iran decided we will just take some of that $150 billion and buy us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nukes from North Korea, from Pakistan. We know that during those final years of the Obama administration that Iran had met with Pakistani officials, with North Korean officials. So that was certainly a possibility, but I wondered if the IAEA had a capability of noting and discovering if Iran were to import a nuclear weapon from, say, North Korea or Russia or Pakistan. And apparently, unless the Iranians brought their new nuclear weapons immediately near the detection equipment, there would be no way to know that Iran bought nuclear weapons. So to anyone who used reason in dealing with the largest supporter of terrorism in the world, responsible for killing so many precious American military members and others. President Trump did a great thing. He did the right thing. It was a great thing to do for America's future safety. It was a great thing to do for the world's safety. And it was absolutely a helpful thing to do for the nation of Israel. So that was smart. We've had these different climate accords, and what so many of them have in common basically was, gee, we will pay the world lots of money, supposedly some type of guilt money, even though we have been more philanthropic than any other country in the history of the world. And to any astute eye examining the state of the world and world history, it becomes very clear the only countries that are able to do anything about pollution on the planet are countries that have a strong, vibrant economy. Countries that are struggling, you know, they're doing all they can to put people to work, to survive. They just can't spare the money to clean up the environment. You got countries like China and India, massive polluters, and under these accords, heck, China wouldn't even have requirements kick in for them to clean things up till 2030, and by then there would be all new agreements that would probably give China even more time. These accords appeared to be geared for one thing: do damage to the economy of the one country that's doing so much to clean up carbon emissions, to clean up pollution. Article here back from Forbes, this was back fall of 2017. Yes, the U.S. leads all countries in reducing carbon emissions. And, you know, that was 10 months into the Obama administration. But as the Environmental Protection Agency announced, we are leading the nation, we're leading the world with respect to our CO2 footprint in reductions. The Washington Post fact-checked this claim and rated it 3 Pinocchios, which means they rate the claim mostly false. They further wrote, Pruitt's usage of data appeared to be a deliberate effort to mislead the public, but the data mostly supports Pruitt's claim. You have to consider the source, just like during my days on the bench, as felony judge, major civil litigation. It was all about the credibility of the witness, and as we've seen, the Washington Post is exceedingly biased, slanted in their reporting, and so we need a source that gives Pinocchios to the Washington Post, because if you look at the 2017 BP Statistical Review of World Energy, since 2005, annual U.S. carbon dioxide emissions have declined by 758 million metric tons. That is by far the largest decline of any country in the world over that time span, and is nearly as large as the 770 million metric ton decline for the entire European Union. By comparison, the second largest decline during that period was registered by the United Kingdom, which reported a 170 million metric ton decline. So we had 758 million metric ton decline in carbon emissions in that year, and UK was second. not quite up to our 758 million metric tons. They were at 170 million metric ton decline. But at the same time, China's carbon dioxide emissions grew, and that's grew, by 3 billion metric tons, and India's grew by 1 billion metric tons. So we're over here in the United States trying not to destroy our economy and yet cleaning up the environment more than anybody else in the world. And this ridiculous accord, really a treaty, allows the biggest polluters in the world to keep polluting much more, just either one of those, than the rest of the world. It's just phenomenal. The article goes on. The Washington Post gets into per capita emissions, and indeed, despite the decline, the U.S. per capita emissions are still among highest in the world. However, the Washington Post story claimed, quote, the United States may have had the largest decrease in carbon emissions, but is still the largest per capita emitter. That's not accurate either. According to the World Bank data, U.S. per capita carbon dioxide emissions rank 11th among countries. So we are not the largest per capita emitter, but we do emit 2.2 times as much on a per capita basis as China. But China has 4.3 times as many people, and that matters from an overall emissions perspective. China's lower per capita carbon dioxide emissions are more than offset by its greater population. So China emits over 70% more carbon dioxide annually than the United States. So there's a lot of manipulation as to what's going on, but it's ridiculous for the United States to be part of a treaty in which the United States is punished and our economy punished and the American people punished, even though we are cutting the carbon dioxide emissions more than anyone else. Another article from Liz Peek on the Hill, China's rising emissions prove Trump right on the Paris Agreement. And this article is from last year. That nothing horrifies the intelligentsia more than President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change. But based on new information on China's emissions, it increasingly looks like the president made the right call. Just last week, an analysis from Greenpeace indicated that China's 2018, and the numbers we were quoting before were from the year before, but indicated China's 2018 carbon emissions were on a track to grow at the fastest rate in 6 years. The study, based on government data regarding the use of coal and other energy sources, shows carbon output rising 4% in the first quarter of this year. Analysts are projecting similar gains over the next several quarters. The weakness of the Paris Agreement was that it was lopsided, requiring little from China and a great deal from the U.S. President Obama, committed to the United States to reducing carbon emissions in 2025 by 26 to 28%, which would have meant a substantial jump in electricity costs. By contrast, China committed to boosting non-fossil fuels to around 20% of its overall energy mix by 2030, and a hope that emissions might peak at that time. As one analyst commented in the New York Times, quote, what China is pledging to do here is not a lot different from what China's policies are on track to deliver. So the president really did do the right thing for the American public. We lost a great man, a former member of this body, and John Dingell. He and I had disagreements over some issues, but I knew John Dingell, I knew and I know he was an honest man. He was an honorable man. He was a very decent man. He was a genuine asset to this legislative body. He followed the rules. He made others follow the rules. And yet he was removed as chairman of Energy and Commerce, even though he was looking forward to working diligently on a health care bill. He was removed as chairman of the committee because he made a statement that can still be found on YouTube. Like I said, he was an honest man. He did not want to move the cap and trade bill out of his committee. As he said, that cap and trade bill is basically, the big thing in it was a carbon tax. He said that cap and trade bill is not only a tax, it's a great big one. And he had talked about how when you skyrocket the cost of energy, you know, the rich people are inconvenienced, but it's the poor in the nation. It's the lower middle class. It's the senior citizens on a fixed income, on Social Security, where they may go for years without getting a cost of living increase. And even if they get one, it doesn't keep up with skyrocketing energy costs. And he could not abide hurting poor people, hardworking, lower middle class people with skyrocketing energy that they couldn't afford to pay. And that's where so many of these things lead. If we're going to have compassion on the people that are the working poor, for heaven's sake, the last thing you want to do to them is skyrocket the cost of what they absolutely have to have just to exist. In America today, you've got to have energy. Whether it's electric energy, whether it's natural gas energy, gasoline, diesel, you've got to have energy. Even a wood-burning stove, you've got to have energy. And these kind of bills that push for these kind of efforts devastate the working poor in this country. So here's an article from Justin Sykes. It also is from 2017, but analyzing Obama's Paris Agreement, and the title says, "All Cost and No Benefit for the United States." So I am pleased that President Trump withdrew us from the treaty that was never properly ratified and that would continue to send jobs to China and India from the United States. We have a president who understands before America can continue to be the most philanthropic country in the world, helping those less fortunate, you need a vibrant economy, and simply bringing the U.S. economy down to the almost no rate of growth during the Obama years is not going to help us help other countries. So the economy, some may recall, you can go back and see President Obama talking in terms of basically the 3% growth is a thing of the past. Economy can't grow that. We need to get used to the new normal. Well, under this president, the new normal is over 3% growth. And the only chance we have to overcome our massive deficit and growing deficit is to get the economy going so strongly that it grows in enough sufficient manner that we are able to start paying down our deficit if we will just quit the massive overspending. Now, we have had quite a show really more of a circus in our Judiciary Committee the last couple of days. It's really been outrageous. The Judiciary Committee ought to be, if anything, the last bastion of civility in this town. Judiciary Committee should be the committee from which good rules emanate that inspire others in the country and around the world, that we have a model that can be followed. And what occurred in our Judiciary Committee in the last 2 days has made a mockery of the legislative process. And something that our committee, under our new majority, Democrat majority, has not been willing to focus on, that is a threat to our First, Second, Fourth, Fifth Amendment rights, is the overreach by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, potentially by the intel community, in taking away Americans' right to have privacy in their phone conversations, in their emails, their right to have a court system in which the judges are not closer to being the prosecutor than they are actual even-handed judges. And one of the things that is a huge concern, for me, should be a huge concern for all Americans. I know it used to be a big concern with our now chairman, Nadler. I know my first term here in 05 and 06. At that time, Congressman Nadler was a great stalwart in pushing for privacy rights and civil liberties to make sure the government under the Bush administration didn't overreach. But an interesting thing happened on the way to their majority and having the Obama administration in charge. There seemed to be a complete loss of interest in protecting civil liberties of people whom the Obama administration chose to spy on. And I know that the Attorney General has said he's going to be following up with critically important investigations now, but I would hope, and maybe the majority just really doesn't want to protect Americans' rights, more focused on trying to destroy the current president, but there are things that have now arisen. Evidence is clear. Massive, widespread abuse at the top of the FBI, top of the DOJ, potentially in the intel area, and even to the point that we would have a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, who, in the words of Wilford Brimley, once said, last time we had a leak like this, Noah built himself an ark. And that seems to be what has happened under Mueller's watch when he was at the FBI, under Mueller's watch as a special counsel. And a good example is in this article from BuzzFeed. They're certainly no fan of mine, but the editor, the news editor-in-chief, Ben Smith, has this article from April 18th, 2019. And in this article, he says, our reporters, talking about the BuzzFeed reporters, went back to the two senior law enforcement sources who had told them, as the article put it, that, quote, Donald Trump directed his longtime attorney Michael Cohen to lie to Congress about negotiations to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, according to two federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of the matter, unquote. That means that's got to be a couple of people on the Mueller team leaking information that turns out was not accurate, but leaking information for one reason, obviously, since it turned out not to be accurate, to do harm to the President of the United States. That is not the job of the Department of Justice or the FBI. Further down in the article, it says, and this is the news editor-in-chief talking at BuzzFeed, our story was based on detailed information from senior law enforcement sources. That reporting included documents specifically, and get this, specifically pages of notes that were taken during an interview of Cohen by the FBI. Now, we got to looking at this issue back regarding witness statements that are taken down by the FBI, and it's really time that the FBI came on up into the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century. I'm not even asking them to come to the 21st century, but a practice of the FBI has been, and it's advantageous to law enforcement that does this. It's not really honorable, but it is advantageous. They don't like to film or record statements made by witnesses. They prefer to have an FBI agent take notes of their interpretation of what the witness is saying. If they recorded it by video or audio tape, then when there was a question, well, which is right, the FBI agent's notes or the actual words coming from the witness's mouth, then you could go to the tape and find out which was actually accurate. But when there is no recording, then the advantage goes strictly, and you're strictly to the benefit of the government agent because, gee, they've got no convictions. They come into court. I saw so many felonies being tried in my court. I've tried felonies many times. But you know which way the jury is normally going to go. They're going to believe the law enforcement officer, especially prior to the last few years, back when the FBI had a much higher, well thought of reputation, been devastated in recent years, but they come in and testify, and the witness says, that's not what I said. You don't get to see a video. You don't get to hear the audio of what the witness actually said. What you have to decide between is this FBI agent that's never been convicted and looks good on the stand, sounds good on the stand, and this defendant that probably has a criminal record. So that usually goes in the direction of the FBI agent. But now most state and local law enforcement offices have done more and more to record statements, to record what happens so that juries can see for themselves. So they don't have to judge between the credibility of the law enforcement or a defendant. They see for themselves, they hear for themselves what was said or done. The FBI doesn't like to do that. They much prefer to have agents make their notes of their interpretation of what the defendant said, and Mueller particularly loved that during his 12 years as director of the FBI because his people always got the benefit of the doubt, and they were able to convict people because the FBI agent, who may have completely misinterpreted what was said in his or her notes, they get the benefit and the defendant gets convicted. So that's been a great strategy for law enforcement. Some people felt like I was a hang 'em high type felony judge, but I wanted fairness. We got to have fairness. And because of the credibility issues of the FBI, I feel comfortable Christopher Wray won't do it. He's more interested in trying to rebuild the image of the FBI without actually correcting anything. So I'm sure he's correcting some things, but certainly he's not changing 302, the witness statements taken down in writing as the FBI agent's interpretation. But, and there are other indications, he's more interested in trying to have a good front, making it look like the FBI is better now. But there are actions that do need to be taken. But this story, going back to it, that reporting included documents, specifically pages of notes that were taken during an interview of Cohen by the FBI. In those notes, one law enforcement source wrote that, quote, DJT personally asked Cohen to say negotiations ended in January, and White House counsel office knew Cohen would give false testimony to Congress. Sanctioned by DJT, joint lawyer team reviewed a letter Cohen sent to SSCI about his testimony about Trump Tower Moscow et al., knowing it contained lies. Well, it turns out those notes that were taken by FBI agents were not accurate, which again causes problems for credibility. But the real problem is the fact that you had investigators, which must have been FBI, working for the Mueller team, and they're turning over documents that at least were law enforcement sensitive, and they're probably classified to some level. And as we know, as people looked into it after former FBI Director Comey basically admitted a crime, that he had leaked information that he had taken down or typed up in a memo based on his conversation with the president. Well, under the FBI rules and regulations, that's not his property. It's not to be leaked, and yet he leaked it to a professor friend so that the professor friend could get it out to the press. I think it was the New York Times. But regardless, get it out to the press for the sole purpose of trying to get a special counsel appointed to harass President Trump. So you've got the former FBI director. What kind of example was that? Comey's knowingly leaking information that was potentially criminal to leak. And so when you have the FBI director potentially committing overt crimes himself, what kind of example, what do you expect that to do inside the FBI? As an example, I know from talking to FBI agents from all over the country, they were and still are amazed at the things that top people in the FBI in Washington did to destroy FBI credibility. And of course, I think part of that was a result of Robert Mueller's 5-year up or out policy. He used it to eliminate people in the FBI that had more law enforcement experience than him. He ran off thousands and thousands of years of experienced, ethical, moral, upstanding FBI agents. You might wonder, why would an FBI director run off their most experienced agents from all over the country? And really the only reason I can think of that you would do that, you know, young guys coming right out of school that are patriotic, they come in, They take their orders. They don't have the experience to know when it's a stupid order or maybe a improper order. And so they're not going to talk back. They're going to salute Mueller and go do what he said, whereas he knew that people that are longer in the tooth, that have been around, when he ordered one of his ridiculous policies into effect that he'd later have to repeal, he didn't want the experienced FBI agent saying, "Sir, I know it seems like a good idea, but 15 years ago we tried that and here was the result. It doesn't work out like you think it's going to." Mueller didn't want anybody there that would do that kind of thing. He didn't want anybody that knew more than he did. He ran off thousands of years of experience. I cannot help personally but think if Mueller had not run off so many thousands of years of FBI experience, there would have been people around inside the FBI who could have nudged an FBI director like Comey to avoid committing crimes, could have encouraged an idiot like Peter Strzok, maybe a great law enforcement officer at one time, but clearly immoral, illegal in his conduct, and a disgrace to the FBI, and a guy that can lie with a smirk on his face. That was pretty impressive. But there would have been people around to say, you can't do that. And if you don't stop, I'm going to report you. Well, Mueller ran those guys off. He didn't want people like that. And a good example is the FBI agent that after Ted Stevens, under the Mueller FBI, was tried and convicted of a crime that he did not commit right before the election, so he lost his seat in the U.S. Senate. We had an FBI agent came forward, filed an affidavit that he swore to. The FBI had, in effect, manufactured a case against Ted Stevens that did not exist, that he did not accept hundreds of thousands of improvement to his home. He paid for them. He overpaid for them, but the FBI did their raids. They hid evidence that he needed to, and it would have exonerated, not just raised a reasonable doubt, but completely exonerated himself. And the FBI agent identified his superior that participated in manufacturing that crime. So what happened with Mueller as director of the FBI when he finds out, if he didn't already know, that he had a supervisor agent who manufactured a case to convict an innocent man? Well, the Mueller FBI ran off the guy that filed the affidavit because he had a conscience, and Mueller didn't want people of conscience in the FBI under him. He wanted people that would salute Mueller, salute the flag, and do whatever he wanted done. And apparently in that case, even manufacturing a criminal case against a U.S. senator, the longest-serving Republican in the Senate at that time. And, of course, you have the case of Dr. Stephen Hatfield. Mueller had no evidence whatsoever that Stephen Hatfield was guilty of the anthrax crime that killed and harmed people after 9/11. And at one point, the non-existence of any evidence caused, apparently, from reports, President George W. Bush to call Mueller in and say, hey, it doesn't look like there's any evidence here. Are you really sure that Dr. Hatfield is the anthrax defendant, the guy? And Mueller reportedly said, I am 100% certain. There was no evidence, none. He just had a feeling. He basically framed an innocent man, and ultimately the U.S. government had to pay over $6 million in settlement to Dr. Hatfield. He didn't really get his life back. We still talk about him in terms of anthrax. But when Mueller was asked if he had any regrets, apologies. He said absolutely not. He had no apologies. He didn't care if he ruined an innocent man's life. Never apologized about Ted Stevens. And, of course, Ted Stevens was killed in a plane he would never have been on if the Mueller FBI had not manufactured a case against him. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise here that you have a Mueller team. It's got to be Mueller investigators. They're the ones that were doing this investigation. And they're leaking their own documents that are not to be leaked. Well, unless they're directed to by Mueller, so I guess that's a possibility. But anyway, leaking this to the press. And it wasn't just one FBI agent, according to the BuzzFeed News editor-in-chief, because he says in the story he wrote that they had, and I'm quoting, senior law enforcement sources. And they gave BuzzFeed, this liberal news organization, being kind here, gave them the FBI notes to try to bring pressure on Cohen. That's the reason normally that law enforcement does this, to build up public hysteria against somebody and hatred for someone so that they ultimately give up and agree to testify however they're asked to testify. Now, this BuzzFeed editor also says, at the time, the sources asked reporters to keep the information confidential. But with the publication of Mueller's report, they have permitted its release. That is so outrageous. I mean, was nothing learned from the FBI framing the wrong person in the Atlanta bombing case? Apparently not. What happened to Kirk Weldon? He used to come speak from this very podium multiple times in 2000. It was in my first term. I think it was mainly in 2006. And he kept alleging that the FBI had information that they knew there was going to be a terrorist attack, just like what happened on 9/11. And I didn't know where Congressman Weldon knew what he was talking about. He sure seemed to. And he kept making these allegations that the FBI didn't do their job. They could have saved 3,000 American lives on 9/11. Anyway, it was very tough allegations at the FBI. And as a freshman, I'm thinking, wow, Mueller's got to come back and respond to this. This looks bad for the FBI. Even though he only took over shortly before 9/11, it still makes his FBI look bad. Mueller's got to come out and address this. And apparently Director Mueller, FBI Director Mueller, did address the allegations of Congressman Kirk Weldon, because 2 weeks before his election that year in 2006, there was a raid of Weldon office, his daughter's law office, and it was early morning, and the press was all there. Gee, had to have been the FBI. They're doing the raid. They got the press all there, and in no time at all, there were protesters with already made signs at Kirk Weldon's office calling him all kinds of thief and different things. And that occurring 2 weeks before the election caused him to narrowly lose. And then some months later, they were notified by the FBI, oh, by the way, you can come get all that stuff we seized during our raid. We didn't really use it for a grand jury or anything. They apparently used it to defeat Kirk Weldon as a member of Congress who made them feel bad. An intelligent person might ask, well, look, if that's what the FBI has done to people in the past, whether Hatfield or Weldon or Stevens, Aren't you concerned doing just what Kirk Weldon did? And the fact is, it should be a matter of concern. We are seeing, even from BuzzFeed, how the FBI will disclose information that's not even accurate to bring down public opinion against both a witness and, in that case, the president himself, just to smear somebody's name even when it's not accurate. So it should be a matter of concern, but if people don't stand up in this body, actually the way Jerry Nadler used to years ago about concerns with federal law enforcement activities, if we don't stand up here, nobody's going to, and it isn't going to get better. So it's a risk we got to take because somebody's got to speak up about these outrageous abuses. And they truly are abuses. Now, as the evidence continues to come out, what appears to be quite clear was not that there was collusion or conspiracy between the Trump campaign to bring down Hillary Clinton as a candidate, but the Russian effort has not changed, not when they were the Soviet Union and now that it's an independent country of Russia. They want to cause as much problem and division in the United States as they can. And boy, did it work this time. Just a little over a week ago, apparently former MI6 agent, secret agent, he's no 007, that's for sure, but Christopher Steele, hired by Fusion GPS, also hired Nellie Orr, who is the wife of a top FBI official named Bruce Orr, and she was digging up dirt, whatever she could find. That was why she was hired on Donald Trump. And Christopher Steele, who hated candidate Donald Trump, was hired to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. And as I understand it, he didn't even go to Russia. He's calling, emailing, whatever he needs to do to communicate, and word gets out around Russia. This British agent, now working for the Clinton campaign through Fusion GPS, and working with at least one FBI top official, he's looking for dirt on Donald Trump in Russia. Steele has now basically admitted, you know what? It could well be that the people that gave me this dirt about prostitutes and Donald Trump, it's now turned out to be 100% fabricated. It's possible that those could be agents for Vladimir Putin. You think? You bet. Russia was able to divide this country and had plenty of willing accomplices in what turned out to be an outrageously corrupt top in the FBI and some in the DOJ. Now, I know Mr. Rosenstein has said, oh, he was joking when he said he would wear a wire into the Oval Office to try to trap Donald Trump as president so they could try to remove him as president. I mean, they were working on a coup. But from what I understand, we know he was not joking because there was a second meeting in which Andy McCabe and another person, at least one more person, were there when Rosenstein brought it up on his own again. Hey, I wasn't kidding. I really am a team player. I know you're mad at me for the memo about Comey that allowed him to be fired, but I'm a team player. I want to be part of the team. I'll wear a wire into the Oval Office to try to trap the president. I'm really willing to do that. And McCabe apparently just blown away that Rosenstein would offer to do that again, goes back and has a meeting with his subordinates and says, you won't believe Rosenstein just brought up again. He's willing to wear a wire into the Oval Office. I don't know what's wrong with that guy. Well, there is a massive stench that has existed, came about during the Obama administration, came about when Robert Mueller ran off so many of our incredibly qualified, upstanding FBI agents. And I was hoping that when Christopher Wray came in, he would help clean up the mess, get rid of the bad actors, but he's been more of hold what you got and try to make the picture look rosier. And why would I say that? It's because I know from having talked to the individuals that found the information, they knew that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked by a foreign country, and it was not Russia. And I knew at the time I was asking Peter Strzok questions, but I didn't mention the country. But now it's come out that a Chinese intelligence agency had embedded instructions in her private server that every email coming in and every email going out was to go to this Chinese intelligence agency. And it happened. And we also now know there was classified information that came and went through her private server. But the Inspector General for our intelligence community was so concerned, he told his investigator, Frank Rucker, Frank, you got to get over there and tell the FBI. They don't know that her private server was hacked. You got to go tell them. And this didn't come out in the hearing. I didn't bring it up. But I did ask Strzok, because we know from his private texting that he was doing everything he could to exonerate Hillary Clinton and doing everything he could to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. And so it had to come as an incredible blow to Peter Strzok when the intelligence community's investigator, their IG investigator, comes over to the FBI as directed by the IG, and he has to tell Peter Strzok because he's director of counterintelligence at the FBI. And they have their liaison there, Dean Chappelle, and they have another person there. And the IG also sent over one of their top lawyers, Jeanette Mitchell. And Rucker says, I needed to get you this information, and you weren't responding. So here it is. We now have proof positive that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked, and it was hacked by China. And it's going, every email coming in, going out, it's going to their intelligence agency. And this didn't come out in the hearing, but the fact is, he was shocked at the response by Peter Strzok because he just looked at him. He showed no surprise. And Chappelle and Strzok thanked Frank Rucker for the information, shook his hand, and sent him on his way as if it were no big deal. So where does Christopher Wray come in there? After that came out, that our United States intelligence IG had proof positive that Hillary Clinton's private server had been hacked, and after it was exposed what a detriment, possibly criminal activity by Peter Strzok, and after it came out that they were instructed that her private server was hacked, what does Christopher Wray's FBI do? They release an official statement that the FBI still has not seen any evidence that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked. That was despicably dishonest. All they had to do was contact the intelligence community, IG's office. They could have gotten the information, but Christopher Wray was more interested in trying to preserve the old reputation of the FBI that he continued with the facade. Well, yeah, we put on our blinders. We see no evil. We hear no evil. We don't know about any evil. We're not going to go look at the evidence that absolutely unequivocally shows her private server was hacked. We will just ignorantly and intentionally mislead the American people and say, we haven't seen any evidence that her private server was hacked. This is a dangerous, dangerous time in our history. And people can throw all the rocks at Bob Barr. I didn't know the guy. I don't think I've ever met the man. And I had concerns because he was a private friend of Bob Mueller, and his wife was a friend of Mrs. Mueller. I had concerns. And now that he is trying to get to the bottom of all the corruption within the FBI and top of the DOJ, the rocks are being hurled. But this should be a time when we come together to try to root out the corruption. Because if they can attempt a coup of a duly elected president, whether you like the Electoral College or not, they can do it to a Republican, then the day can come when you have conservative people who disagree with a liberal president and decide to take him out the way they made so much inroads in almost taking out Donald Trump. This is a scary time in our history, and I literally hope and pray, and I know there are people that make fun of the prayers, but I truly believe prayers have brought about God's blessing on this country, and we've got a chance to fix things here. But it's going to take courage by people that are willing to stand up to an FBI, some corruption at the top. There's still some people at the FBI who do not like Donald Trump, and they're still there, and they still would like to cover for people that were helping try to effectuate this attempted coup on Donald Trump. They need to go, but we need people. I mean, it used to be, and I know personally, assistant U.S. attorneys that are career, FBI agents that were career. Most of the time, you didn't even know how they voted. You don't know if they did vote because they had one interest, getting to the truth of whether or not there was probable cause a crime was committed, and if so, who probably committed it. That gets them an indictment. Then they can go for a conviction. That's what they were interested in, enforcing the law. But the FBI under Robert Mueller became, and then James Comey became an instrument to abuse enemies, and it's got to be cleaned up. And I've seen no indication Christopher Wray is interested in doing that. He's covering for the guys that created the problem. Maybe he's doing some things internally I'm not seeing, but he's not the answer. For the sake of continuing this little experiment in self-government, we need to clean up the mess at the FBI in Washington, D.C., and the mess that still has existence in the top of the Justice Department. And then we can have a chance to keep this little experiment self-government going. I yield back.